In case any of you noticed today that I'm wearing one dress shoe and one casual shoe, it's not because I couldn't tell what I was doing when I put them on this morning. I sprained my foot a week ago in the backyard. There was a rock under the leaves, and I was chasing an arrow or something. Didn't think about the rock, stepped on it, and then twisted my foot. Didn't twist the ankle, just the foot, so it sort of strained the ligaments. And then the next morning, we headed on the long circuit, the Pittsburgh wheeling run, and I just put my boot on over a thick sock, which you normally wear in those boots. And when I got home that night after standing for 2 sermons and then standing and visiting and fellowshipping and driving with the foot down, I could barely get the boot off. So it's been very painful all week, just getting better now. So I'm wearing a loose shoe, and then the dress shoe is laced like it's supposed to be. So just to explain myself, so I don't look half-witted or anything like that. You know that hymn that we just sang? If you noticed at the bottom, there's a timeless quality instantly to the music there. It's a traditional Welsh melody, which when it's a traditional Welsh or English or Dutch or Finlandia, which is the traditional Finnish melody, they don't know who composed them. They have been inherited down through the centuries. And I often wonder if certain of those are not, at least the core of the melody is something that maybe David wrote, or one of the other musicians that David trained and worked with, or that came out of the school of music that he established when they were getting ready to build a temple when Solomon would take over. But there's a timeless, magnificent quality to those particular tunes, and it just kind of adds to the song, because you notice the lyrics. The lyrics were written in World War I or World War II, one or the other. Bombs that shower destruction through the night, and praying for the time when war is over. That all applies, of course, for us when the Great Tribulation is coming, and we see ahead. This is one of the, quixotic elements of God's way. We know what's coming, and we don't have to sort of be blindsided by it. So we're already thinking of the trouble the world will be in when the real trouble starts. The rumble of the jet right now is timed just right for these comments. But whatever the case, it's a modern lyrics put to a timeless melody, which, when it's a Celtic one, and the Welsh are Celtic, which means they're Israelite background, it's some of those just have to be echoes of things that David wrote a long time ago. We'll find out when we get to the resurrection. There'll be a lot of great questions. We'll get mysteries answered from our era, and everybody else will have some from their eras as well. Well, what can you learn from the history of the Bible in the Old and New Testaments? How do you analyze the stories in the Scriptures? How do you weigh the actions of the people involved? There's in the original Spokesman's Club manual, there was a letter that was written by Mr. Armstrong to the men. The Spokesman's Club, by the way, for those who don't know what that is, that was a men's speech club that we had in the church that started in the late 50s and then was spread clear across the church around the world in the early 60s and continued on right into the 90s. And then we began to use the same principles from it and variations of it in the United Church of God, where we organized in 1995. But it's a wonderful speech training program. A lot of our speakers were trained in the course of the Spokesman's Club training. So in the introductory letter, he wrote, "Watch world events. See things as God sees them." That was incorporated into how you prepare your speeches and how you analyze what's going on around it. Now we've got current conditions around the world that are just a little bit on the scary side. Not unexpected. The big ripple is America recognizing Israel's capital as Jerusalem this week. That's the hot news item right now. And what does that portend? One Church of God groups thinks that I'm aware of, and sometimes I monitor their emailings, thinks that the United States is the beast of Bible prophecy. They're wrong, but that's what they think. And this was proof positive. Setting up his tabernacle between the seas in Daniel. And he thinks that the leader of... But we have a lot of world events that are transpiring, and you think, well, how do we... Apostles or through the other prophets. Let's look at, though, the principle here in 1 Corinthians. In reading the Bible, we know that traditional others do recognize that there is a value of the events, the stories of the Old Testament. And so give them credit where credit is due. I'm glad to see that they recognize that. We have that made very clear here. This entire chapter talks about the events of the Exodus. It has to do with the days of unleavened bread, which was the setting for the letter anyway. And the crossing the Red Sea was all part of the last day of unleavened bread is when that was done. That's all made clear in the first few verses. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. That's crossing the Red Sea. And you think, well, how were you baptized into the cloud in going through the sea? Well, you had water to the left of you and water to the right of you as they went down into the seabed of the Red Sea. And but there's no water above you. Yes, there is. Remember that Christ was leading them, and he used a cloud. His presence was in a cloud, water vapor. Thus you had water above them as well. So it was a symbolic baptism. It wasn't a baptism to spiritual conversion like the New Testament brethren experienced, but it was a symbolic baptism of the nation. As they were leaving Egypt, coming out of sin, the type of sin, and they were following the lead of Christ. It goes on to say that right there in verse 4. Now, that's all Old Testament history. The Exodus, the plagues of Egypt, and crossing the Red Sea, and the wandering years in the wilderness, and moving in and settling in Israel, in the Promised Land, and then conquering the Promised Land, and then eventually ending up with kings after the period of the Judges, which was on again, off again. Israel blew hot and cold constantly. Hot, in fervor for being faithful for a little while, and then suddenly they started getting cold from the toes up. And they decided that they would worship the pagan gods and goddesses. Or they would sort of mix both, play both ends against the middle type of thing. That was constantly repeated in their history. And that also was repeated in their royal history when they had kings. And then, Saul, David, and Solomon were the three men who ruled all 12 tribes. We'll get into that because we're going to go through a very interesting example in just a minute. And verse 6. Now these things, all these things that happened in the time of the Exodus throughout the Old Testament, the principles applies there. All these things happened, have became our examples that we look to learn from. Mr. Ritter talked about his example that his brother looked to and learned from. And nobody's worthless. You can always be a bad example, but I'm sure he was a good example as well. I think maybe his brother was pulling his cord a little bit at the time that he said that. But we all learn from examples, and we set examples others will learn from as well. Okay, so all these things became our examples. And what the things referred to there are the Old Testament events, the history of God's work with people in the Old Testament, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, and do not become idolaters as some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to play, to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Nor to let us be destroyed by the serpents, nor complain, as some of them complain. The ends of the ages have come. So we learn from the Old Testament, and guess what? This age, in soon to be the events that lead up to the return of Christ. And the records of how Paul wrote in the letters, as the sermonette was brought out an excellent example, or the life of Christ on earth. Work. This thinking about it and thinking creatively about God's Word. We're going to read thus and such an event, and it's back in 2 Kings. While you're turning there, let me give you a rehearsal of history. You need to know the set. I like to have a timeline in my head. King David became the king of all 12. He reigned 40 years, so he died in 9. Solomon reigned 40 years, which meant that he died in 930 BC. Israel split that very year, 930. It broke apart because 10 of the tribes, Solomon's son, did not inherit the wisdom his father had. Otherwise, he would have lowered the taxes because they needed to be lowered. They were high. There were a lot of great building projects that were being done in Solomon's day. He was the builder. So David was the establisher of the kingdom, and Solomon then built the things, the temple and palaces and various cities in Israel. Rehoboam, his son, didn't have the wisdom to say, yes, we need to back off on the taxes, let the people recover their own fortunes for a time. And so he said instead my father's thigh will be like my little finger when it comes to taxes. That's very King George III-ish. If they come forward to American history, that's what King George told the American colonies. You're going to pay taxes like you've never paid before. And they say, because they were now Americans and they could speak in grunts. And it was a for sure. And it became known as the Revolutionary War. Well, they had a there. 10 tribes broke away, led by Jeroboam. Jeroboam was an administrator under King Solomon over Ephraim. He was an Ephraimite. But Jeroboam had a flaw. He wasn't really truly a worshiper of God. He liked paganism. That wasn't unusual. Most of the Israelites liked paganism. Most of the Israelites today like paganism. Paganism means not worshiping the true God. Instead, they worship gods that they make up. For some, that's money. For some, that's fame. For some, that's an established pagan god with pagan gods and goddesses. And we think, we don't have that today. Yes, we do, because if you go and study the core of traditional Christianity, you'll find that it has largely got its doctrines extracted from paganism, and many of its practices established and extracted from ancient paganism. Israel was constantly fighting the pagan battle, but it was in 930 that it split in two. So 10 of the tribes in the north part of the country became the kingdom or the house of Israel. Kingdom or house of versus south, you had the house of Judah. Judah was the dominant tribe, the biggest tribe. It was Benjamin was a brother of Joseph, not of Judah. So how in the world did Judah and Benjamin get linked together? Well, God is the one who, in the book of Joshua, he established the inheritances, the land that each tribe would get when they moved across the Jordan River and settled in the Promised Land. The territory given to Benjamin, because Benjamin was a small tribe, was immediately north of the border with Judah. And it incorporated a specific city that they hadn't conquered yet. It took a while, clear until the time of David, for them to conquer it. It was called Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a Benjamite city. Consequently, being the capital, they were. So the house of Judah included Judah and Benjamin, and one other. Some of Levi would probably have mixed in with the other tribes, but the bulk of it stayed down there. Joseph was split into two because he got the birthright, which means he got a double portion of the inheritance. He had 13 tribes. But the 13th tribe then was is going to provide the priesthood. So they don't get a land in the instructional, educational, religious leadership, and social services of the country. They will have cities, and then they'll take their turns being down where sacrifices and all the other things. So it gives you an overview of how the 12 and 13 tribes settled out. But at the time that we're going to be reading about is when the tribes split in two. So you had Judah and Benjamin into the south with Levi mixed in, and then the other 10 tribes were all in the north. They had two different kings, Rehoboam, son of Solomon, in the south, in Judah, and the house of Israel had Jeroboam. The Israelites broke away successfully, and Jeroboam then instituted paganism. He built golden calves, reminiscent of the golden calf that the Israelites made while Moses was on the mountain receiving the law of God on Mount Sinai. They made a golden calf. Aaron gave the lame explanation that said, well, we threw this gold going down to the south to worship at the temple. He was afraid that then they would, allow. He institutionalized paganism. He made golden calves 20 or 25 miles north of Jerusalem, somewhere in there. And then Dan and Bethel, those are your gods. Worship them. So here we are back to our little countdown, though. We have Israel split into of Israel in the north had various kings. Jeroboam's dynasty didn't last very long. I think completely. All of his potential heirs were killed because of the idolatry of Jeroboam. The house of Israel had various kings until the late 800s BC. Then there came along a king named Omri, O-M-R-I. In the time of King Omri, that would have been about 885 to 875 BC. That was the time of his reign. He wasn't king very long, about 8 years, but he established a dynasty of significance in the house of Israel, the kingdom of Israel in the north. The Assyrians began to trade with Israel during his dynasty. So they were introduced to the Israelites as the subjects of Omri. And in true, called it the land of Omri, the land of the house of Omri, or in Omri, they had a g sound in the front of it, apparently, according to the historical linguists. Mat was what the Israelites were known as, generally at the time, where they were in captivity. When they were taken into captivity, that's what they were known as within Assyria. And that name was where you will follow through various historical maps. You'll be able to find various iterations of Omri. Omri died, and his son was one we know all too well, Ahab, King Ahab. That would have been about 874 to 853 BC. Now, trouble brewed with Ahab. In the past, Israel had had many dealings with Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon basically were in where Lebanon, the nation of Lebanon, is today. That was the area of Tyre and Sidon. Those two cities were city-states on the coast. Tyre was south, next to the border with Israel. Sidon was further north. The land of Sidon extended out across Lebanon, encompassing many of the forest lands where the great forests or the cedars of Lebanon came from. King David, at the time they had one king that ruled both city-states, and his name was Hiram, and he was a personal friend and confidant of King David. Somehow they had connected very well, and Hiram, maybe he even knew of God's way from King David. But whatever the case, David ordered lumber from him on numerous occasions, and especially he stockpiled lumber that would be used by Solomon in the building of the temple. And then Solomon ordered more lumber from Hiram, who outlived David and into Solomon's reign. So there was a time when and the Sidonians. Later, they weren't, because those alliances came and went. By the time of King Ahab, Sidon was she was the daughter of the king. The king of Sidon was also the high priest in the whole region, apparently. The high priest He was the high priest of Baal. Therefore, Jezebel, his daughter, who married King Ahab, Baal worship in his part of the country. Other judges did at times. Baal worship was one of the primary versions of paganism. Now, all the various nations well, with Baal, as with virtually all the rest of them, it was the sex. It was the sex industry. The druggy days of the 60s, and I don't know what they call the music today. But that was why it was popular. But it wasn't just the sex. There were all kinds of other darker things. Child sacrifice was one of the other draws. I don't know why that would be a draw. But why is abortion a draw in America? The counterpart for Baal in Babylon was Moloch. That was the father god, the primary god. Then there were the goddesses and the other gods that, went on down from the Moloch and his, whatever his wife's name was. Moloch was worshipped by the Israelites in Jeremiah's time, so about 250 years later from when we're talking about. And in Jeremiah's time, he referred to the area of Tophet. Tophet was a territory just outside the walls of Jerusalem, half mile to a mile to the south. There are two valleys that come together. One is the Valley Kidron, which runs along the walls of Jerusalem from the north to the south, and then in from the west down into that deep valley is another valley, which is called the Valley of the Cheesemakers, or in the Hebrew, Gehinnom, the Valley of Gehinnom. In the New Testament, it's called the Valley of Gehenna, because that's where the city dump eventually was in the time of Christ. And that's where the fire was. He used that as a type of the lake of fire. But where those two valleys met, there was a high place, or a little plateau. And that was called Tophet. That was where when they were worshiping Moloch, they set up his statue, a great bronze statue with a hollow base in the bottom, which they piled into firewood. And when it was stoked and the fire was hot and the metal was searing, they put a baby in the arms of Moloch, and the baby screamed. And they didn't like the screaming, so they beat the drums. And the drums were the Tophet. That's what means the drums, and the sound of the drum is Tophet to them. They beat the drums, so it drowned out the screaming of the child sacrifice to the god Moloch, the pagan god Moloch. Well, that was why that was a huge pull on the Israelites, I don't know. Human nature has its dark and evil elements where it's tuned into Satan's thinking and not God's. The worship of Baal was not dissimilar. Worshiping of Baal earlier, the time we're going to read about in 2 Kings chapter 9, which I haven't turned to. I can't walk and chew gum. I can't talk and turn pages. Here we go. It had very much to do with the Baal worship that Jezebel brought in to the house of Israel. So we're going to go ahead and read now. Ahab is dead. Go back, and he's in previous chapters. You can read the story of Ahab. There's an awful lot. It goes clear back into 1 Kings. When Ahab and Elijah have their primary face-off on Mount Carmel, where they have the gods, or the priests of Baal, challenging Baal to send a fire down from heaven and burn their sacrifice of their big ox that's been stacked on the wood so they can be burned up, and they jump and leap around, cutting themselves. That was how their ceremonies were, a lot of blood flying. And Elijah starts mocking them because they went on and on and on and on and on. Nothing happened. So afternoon, then Elijah said, okay, it's my turn. He says, start dumping all this precious water that you've got in these barrels on top of the oxen that we have sacrificed and stacked on the wood, and then fill the trench that we built around it full of water. And then he prayed for God to intervene and to accept the sacrifice. And a lightning bolt came out of heaven and consumed the oxen and the wood and dried all the water up. And then the people said, Elijah. They started chanting his name. Because you know what Elijah means? God is God. The true God is God, is what they were saying by chanting Elijah. Oh, Jezebel hated him for that. Now, Ahab didn't like him much, but Jezebel hated him because he, made a mockery of her gods, her priests, because she was a high priestess of Baal, remember. Understanding that she was a high priestess of Baal helps you understand why there was such an animosity and such a conflict during that particular time. Now we're down where Ahab died, his number one son took over, the number one son died, and his number two son takes over. His name is Joram. And Elisha the prophet called one of the sons of the prophets. This is verse 1 of chapter 9. And he said, get yourself ready and take this flask of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. Where's Ramoth Gilead? It's always good to have a geography. Study your maps in the Bible so you sort of know where things are in the back pages that you have in your Bible there. Ramoth Gilead. You know where Gilead is. Gilead was on the other side of the Jordan River toward Iraq. And that's where the half-tribe of Manasseh settled, in the northern part of it, and then Reuben, and then Gad going south. And eventually, some of Simeon ended up having territory down to the south end of Gad. But Gilead would be up in the north. And there's a high plateau up there. Today we know that as the Golan Heights. And that's where Syria, whenever Syria invades Israel, they come over the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights are a place of jeopardy for them because Damascus is only 25 miles from the Golan Heights, within artillery range. But then everything in Galilee is within artillery range of the Syrians, which is why it's been such a tug of war with Israel and Syria today. And as far as we know, the Syrians of today are the same as the Syrians of then. The Jews of today are the same as many of the Jews of then. So Ramoth Gilead is referring to that northeast corner of ancient Israel and of the modern nation state. Ramoth, and the TH in Hebrew, is pronounced in Hebrew, has just a hard T sound. Ramoth means heights, the heights of Gilead. It's the Golan Heights, the same place. That's the only plateau that's there. Now when you said go up there, and when you arrive at the place, look for Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and go and make him rise from among his associates and take him into an inner room, and there take the flask of oil and pour it over his head and say, thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee and don't delay. And you're like, okay, so Elisha is now the prophet. And if you think, oh, who was Elisha? He was the successor to Elijah. Elijah trained Elisha, and then Elisha received the mantle, literally the uniform, of Elijah when Elijah was translated. Now, by translating, it wasn't taken to heaven, as traditional Christians think. He was picked up by God, probably in a fiery chariot, angelic chariot, and transported away from a life of constant conflict with King Ahab, where he actually had some peace for a time. He lived someplace else on earth, not far away, because he monitored events in Israel. And then later on you'll find, well, there's a letter coming from Elijah, who 10 years before had disappeared and turned everything over to Elisha, and yet he writes a letter to this particular king? That's right. He was living on earth, and he was still monitoring what was going on. Elijah was sent to various nations by God when you go back and read his life, and that was no exception. It was different nations. We just don't know where that was. But it was within range to send a letter back. So he told this young man, who was of the sons of the prophets. Elijah established the sons of the prophets, mentioned in verse 1, as a school for prophets. It was an educational institution for those that God was calling and using for spiritual leadership in the nation, in the kingdom of Israel, in the northern kingdom. And then he was supposed to, as soon as he had poured the oil over Jehu's head and given him the marching orders from God via Elisha, he was supposed to get out of there. So he got up and he did exactly what he was told. Not always. Some of the prophets didn't do quite what they were told. Then instead of getting out of there when they were told to get out, they lingered. And then they usually died. It was not a good thing to linger. When God says get out, when it's time to get out, then get out. So here we are in verse 4. The young man, the servant of the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. When he arrived, there were the captains of the army sitting in, and he said, I have a message for you, commander. The captains of the army. Captain is a position of command. And so they said, which one? Which one of us are you talking to? And he said, for you, commander. And that was referring to Jehu. And he arose and went into his house, and he poured the oil on his head. And he said to him, thus says the Lord God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. You shall strike down the house of Ahab, your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish. These were his marching orders. This was God's judgment being handed down through the next king. The whole house of Ahab shall perish. I will cut off from Ahab all the males of Israel, both bond and free. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. See, God did the same thing for him. He wiped out Jeroboam's rather, it wiped out his entire legacy or his lineage because he had institutionalized paganism in Israel. Same thing was happening to Ahab's house because he had married Jezebel and she institutionalized Baal worship. So it'll be like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah. It was another one of the short dynasties and predecessors to Jehu. The dogs shall eat Jezebel on the plot of ground in Jezreel. And what's with Jezreel? Remember Naboth, the Israelite who had a land inheritance there. He had a vineyard, and Ahab wanted that vineyard. And he wanted to buy it from him. And he said, I don't want to sell it. It's my inheritance. I'm happy with it. I want to keep it. And then Ahab went into a fit of depression, so he laid on his bed and pouted. And so then Jezebel came and asked him, what are you pouting about? Well, I don't know if she said pouting, but, same inference. And he says, well, that man won't give me his field. I want it. Oh, she said, I'll take care of that. And you go back and read how she took care of it. She had false accusers accuse him at a public meeting of doing some illegal thing, and then he was immediately stoned with stones. She had him murdered. And then Ahab just took the land. So that was sort of what pushed it over the edge with God with regards to Ahab. Their entire dynasty were going to be buried. The dogs will eat Jezebel on the plot of ground at Jezreel. That Jezreel was a location of Naboth's land. And there shall be none to bury her. And he opened the door and he ran. And he fled. So he did what he was told. Then Jehu came out to the servants of his master, and one of them said to him, is all well? What did this madman come to you? Why did this madman come to you? Madman, yeah, come to you. Now, this is typical. Your hard-bitten soldier is considering religious prognosticators as being madmen. And so Jehu responds in kind. Well, you know the man and his babble. What do you expect? And they realize, oh, no, there's something serious went on. They said, that's a lie. Tell us now. And so he said, thus and thus he spoke to me, and thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel. Then each man hastened to take his garment, his cloak, and put it under him, under Jehu, on the top of the steps, and they blew the trumpets, and they shouted, Jehu is king. They coronated him on the spot. Now he was in command of the nation, and the army was behind him. So Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Joram was the current king. He was one of the sons of Ahab, who had been defending Ramoth-Gilead, he and all Israel, against Hazael, king of Syria. Joram had been wounded, so he had retreated. He left the army there, but he went back to recover from his wound down in Jezreel, down in the valley. And Jehu said, if you are so minded, let no one escape from the city and go and tell it at Jezreel. And he rode in a chariot, and he went to Jezreel, for Joram was laid up there, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, was with him. So you had the king of Israel, Joram, and you had King Ahaziah from the nation of Judah to the south. What was he doing up there? Sometimes the Israelites fought with each other. The Jews and the Israelites went back and forth. Other times they didn't. Here's what he was doing. It's just back in chapter 8. Let's lay my eyes on it here. It was there just this morning, too. Yeah. Maybe this is it. All right, and he began to reign. Sorry, it starts on, there we go. Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, began to reign in the king of Judah. He was 32 years old, and he reigned 8 years. And then verse 18, he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as Ahab had done. He walked, this is verse 18, in the ways of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. The daughter of Ahab, therefore, presumably a daughter of Jezebel as well, was the wife of the king of Israel. Therefore, she was the mother of King Ahaziah, who was up there visiting with Joram. They were cousins. That's why he was there. Now, a watchman in verse 17, back in chapter 9, stood in the tower of Jezreel, and he saw the company of Jehu as he came, and he said, I see a company of men. And Joram said, well, send a horseman and ask him if it's peace. So the horseman went galloping out to intercept the crowd that was coming, and he says, thus says the king, is it peace? And Jehu said, what is peace? What do you have to do with peace? You get behind and follow me. And they sent another one. When he didn't return, they sent another galloper out there, did the same thing, and he said, what do you have to do with peace? Turn around and follow me. So they did. And the watchman reported that. And notice verse 29. The watchman reported saying, well, he went up to them, but he's not coming back. And the driving, because he's commenting now on the crowd that's coming toward them in Jezreel, the driving is the driving of Jehu the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. And what do you mean drives? They had horses. Well, they had chariots, battle chariots, and horsemen. The horseman rode a horse. He was driving a chariot. Now, if you've done any watching of Ben-Hur, which is one of the best chariot races that we have on film, that was pretty remarkable. And Charles Heston had to learn how to do that. It was not easy to drive a chariot. It's not like driving a buggy where the horses are harnessed in tandem or lined up and they work together. Often they use a fan harness for chariot pulling, apparently. And then you've got reins for individual horses in your fists, which is a challenge when you have multiple horses. If you want to really go fast, you have to have more horsepower. Then the load is much lighter, so you can drive furiously. That meant Jehu was one big, strong guy, probably huge to the shoulders, and he could manage that because he had a reputation for driving his chariot at breakneck speeds, driving furiously. So Joram realized something was up, the king Joram did, so he got his chariot ready, and Ahaziah got in his chariot, and they went out to meet him. And Joram turned around. It happened that when Joram saw Jehu in verse 22, he said, is it peace, Jehu? And he said, what peace? Notice this, the latter part of verse 22. What peace, as long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcraft are so many? And he pegged it exactly. The witchcraft and the paganism of Jezebel are so many. And Joram turned around and fled. Trouble, it's trouble. And shouted, treachery, Ahaziah, treachery. Then in verse 24, Jehu was not only a chariot driver, he was a powerful bow puller. If he had the muscle power to handle multiple horses and drive like a maniac all the time, as I said, he had big shoulders and upper body strength, which means he must have had a very heavy, powerful bow. The English longbows that they defended England with in the 1400s against France, they found some in a ship that went down about a few decades later, and they drew them up. It was called the Mary Rose. It was founded in the 1980s. They pulled them out, and they found an entire armory full of archery equipment, and they wondered, what was that for? Well, in those days, even though they had gunpowder for cannon, they would send their archers up into the crow's nest. And the object was not to sink the enemy ship, it was to kill the enemy sailors and take the ship and repair it and make it your own. So those guys would be up there in the tree stand shooting the enemy sailors on the deck when they got close enough. So they had a lot of the kinds of bows the English would have had in those days. Well, they found them in the armory of the Mary Rose, and they dried them out, and then they cut exact replicas of those boards. They didn't try to make bows out of those again or make them work. They just got replicas the same size you wood staves. And when they made bows out of them, they found that the lightweight ones pulled 90 pounds. Now, those of us who shoot bows and arrows, none of us can pull 90 pounds. Unless you're a compound guy, you don't have to pull it very far. It's kind of sissy stuff. Then it breaks off to nothing, The English longbow was full pull, full time, all the way back. 90 pounds was the weenie bow. The big bows pulled 140 to 160 pounds. They would send a cloth yard shaft, which was how long they were, 300 to 400 yards and drive it through the armor of the French. That's why the French didn't like them, because they wiped out a lot of the French nobility in the 1400s that way. Jehu would have been shooting something powerful like that. Needless to say, it would be easy to see why it went straight through Joram's back and out his heart as he was driving his chariot away. And then he had his other archers go get Ahaz and execute him. And they died there. Now when Jehu had come to Jezebel, he went from there, he went down in verse 30 to Jezebel, where she was at Jezreel. And she put on her makeup, her painted her eyes, and adorned her head, probably in the fashion of, well, it would seem logical considering she was a high priestess of Baal, probably in the fashion of that. And then she was sitting there in the palace looking out of a window, and Jehu entered the gate, and she said, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" She'd heard the news. And referring to Zimri was a previous king of a previous dynasty that had murdered the king before him. And he looked up at the window, and he didn't even respond to Jezebel. He just shouted to the house, "Who is on my side?" And 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him, and he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down. Now the eunuchs were typically emasculated men, castrated men who served as court officers for kings. This was the standard way it was done back in the day. Eventually it came to where they may not have been emasculated. The term eunuch was used for a minister of a regent of some sort. So they threw her down, and some of her blood splattered, in verse 33, on the wall and on the horses, and he trampled her underfoot. Kind of gruesome, but it's right here in God's word. And when he had gone in, so she was dead, so he went in to have a meal. It was time to eat. And finally, when he got done, he said, this is in verse 34, "Go and see about this accursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." So his men went out to bury her, and they could find no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Evidently, the dogs didn't want to eat that. The dogs ate her, and you think, well, what kind of dogs would do that? That'd be scary to have those kind of dogs. Well, they're wolfish dogs. In those days, dogs weren't pets. They were sort of the scavengers of society, sort of like jackals and hyenas and wolves and coyotes of our day. It was only later that they made them man's best friend, but that time they weren't. They were the cleaner-uppers, just like the carrion-eating birds would have been. So they ate her, just like God said they would. This was divine justice being done. So he said, therefore they came back and told him, and he said, and this is what Jehu said, "This is the word of the Eternal, which he spoke to his servant Elijah, the Tishbite, saying, on the plot of ground at Jezreel, the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel. And the corpse of Jezebel shall be as refuse on the surface of the field in the plot at Jezreel, and they shall not say, here lies Jezebel." In other words, her burial place could not become a pagan shrine. God saw to that and just used Jehu as his tool. Kind of a sobering chapter, isn't it? But there's more. The death toll is going to mount. So Ahab had 70 sons. That's 70 descent. There would be sons and grandsons of Ahab, all potential heirs. And Jehu wrote and sent letters to Samaria, where they were located, to the rulers of Jezreel, and to the elders and to those who reared Ahab's sons, saying, "Now as soon as this letter comes to you, since your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses and a fortified city also," Samaria was their fortified city, "and weapons, then choose your best qualified of your master's sons, set him on your father's throne, and fight for your master's house." You get your army ready, and I already have my army, and then we'll fight to see who gets to be king. The shock treatment already had its effect, and they were exceedingly afraid. In verse 4, "Look, the 2 kings couldn't stand up to him. How can we stand up?" And he who was in charge of the house, and he who was in charge of the city, and the elders, and those who reared the sons of Jehu, wrote to him, saying, "We are your servants. We will do what you tell us, but we will not make anyone king. Do what is good in your sight." So he wrote a second letter. He said, "Send me the heads of those sons." About 70 of them. "Send me the head of the sons by this time tomorrow." And when the messenger came in to Jehu and said, they've got them, they're here, he said, well, stack them in two piles, one at one side of the gate and one at the other side of the gate. And then the next morning, that's where he addressed people from. In verse 9, it says, so it was in the morning that we went out and stood. He said to all the people, you are righteous. You are good people. Indeed, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed these? You see, there wasn't anybody left in the nobility or in the upper echelons of the government of the house of Israel that could say we had no hand in eradicating Ahab's lineage. You know, Ahab's son, the king, the present king, was eliminated by Jehu, too many J's to start names, by Jehu directly, but Jehu pointed out, but who killed these? See, you have committed yourself. We're in this together from now on. Know that nothing shall fall on the earth of the word of the Lord that has spoken concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he said by his servant Elijah. And Jehu killed all the remaining of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and his great men and his close acquaintances and priests, until he left none remaining. Eliminated all the competition, and it was all a part of what God had commanded. And he arose and he departed, and he went to Samaria, and on the way to Beth-eked, Jehu met with the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, who are you? These are now Jewish nobles coming up across the border. He pulls up and he says, who are you? And they answered, oh, we're the brothers of Ahaziah. We came down to greet the sons of the king and the sons of the queen mother. What queen mother? Jezebel was the queen mother. They were the grandsons of Jezebel and Ahab. Part of the lineage of Ahab. He said, take them alive, and they took them alive, and then they executed them. And in verse 15, he departed from there, as all this drama is unfolding, and then he met Jonadab, the son of Rechab. So we have already met, we're already reading about Jehu, and then we read about Jezebel, and you've seen the impact that she had, and now the comeuppance had been paid. But who is the other J? Jonadab, or Jehonadab, as it says here in Jeremiah 35. It says Jonadab. It just spells it with Jehon. J-E, well, I don't know how it's spelled in Jeremiah 35. Let's turn there. He says we need to anyway, because when you read about Jonadab the Rechabite, you've got to read this section that we're just going to summarize a couple of verses out of. But it's very interesting. Now, I'll give you the background on them in a moment. Jeremiah 35, verse 1. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah. Go to the house of the Rechabites. Speak to them and bring them to the house of the Lord, one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. And so this is what Jeremiah did. I took Jazaniah, the son of Jeremiah, not Jeremiah himself, but son of another Jeremiah, and the son of Habazaniah, his brothers and all his sons, and the whole house of the Rechabites, and I brought them to the house of the Lord, to the chamber of the sons of Hanan, which was by the chamber of the princes. And it tells where it is. In verse 5, and I set before the sons of the house of the Rechabites bowls full of wine and cups, and I said to them, drink wine. And their leader stepped forward and said, we will drink no wine. Now here you've been brought into a side room, one of the storage or meeting rooms adjacent to the temple, right in the temple compound. You're right there, and the leading prophet of the eternal God is right before you. He's the one who invited you, and he's got these big bowls or bottles of wine, earthenware bottles of wine and cups, and he said, have some wine. And the leader of this group of men steps up and says, we will have no wine. Thank you, but no thank you. And why? For Jonadab, the son of Rechab, the very Jonadab we're reading about back there with Jehu, Jonadab, the son of 250 years earlier. The time frame between the two is about 249 years, so 250 years round numbered. That's when Jonadab was with Jehu. Jonadab the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, you shall drink no wines, you nor your sons forever. You shall not build a house, sow seed, plant a vineyard, or have any of these, but all your days you'll dwell in tents, that you may live many days in the land where you're sojourners. What do you mean sojourners? Okay, here's the background. What was Moses' wife's name? Remember, he killed the taskmaster, and this is 40 years before the Exodus. Killed the taskmaster, and then the next day he saw wanted posters with his face on them everywhere, dead or alive. And so many whatever they had for money in those days in Egypt. And he ran away. He was a great and powerful prince of Egypt, and he ran away into the wilderness, into the Sinai. And finally he stopped running, and he came across this well where there were these 7 daughters with their flocks of sheep, and were not allowed to the water because of these ornery shepherds, which he went and thumped up on the ornery shepherds and drove their sheep away, and then he watered all the flocks of these girls, and then they brought him home to Papa because of the kind deed that he'd done. He ended up marrying the oldest one, Zipporah. Now, her father's name had 2 names. Reuel is one name, and the other one that we know mostly is Jethro. That became the father-in-law of Moses when he married Zipporah. Well, he ranched with them. He was a sheep raiser like they were for 40 years, and then God sent him back to lead Israel during the Exodus. And when he came out with the Israelites, Jethro came to visit him and to bring his wife back, because she had stayed there during the time of the plagues of Egypt. He watched what Moses was doing, trying to govern every little thing that came up with 3 million Israelites wandering out, coming out of Egypt. And he said, you're going to wear yourself out, son. This is what you got to do. You got to train some men to know these things. Men who aren't covetous, they're honest, they trust God, and they're faithful. You pick those men and you make them captains of thousands and captains of hundreds and captains of 50s and 10s. And then they judge the small matters. Anything that comes up where some judgment is needed, some counsel, you taught them and trained them, then they judge in the small matters, and if it's tougher, send it on up the line until somebody knows what to do. And the really, really tough set questions then will come to you. This way you won't wear yourself out, or them. So Jethro had a brilliant mind for organization. The Kenites, they were actually a branch of Midian, which were referred to as the Kenites. Sort of a clan then, I guess, of Midianites, which were descended from Ham. And so they stayed with Moses during the wandering years for 4 decades, providing intel on the Sinai Peninsula and the travels that they were at as he needed. And when it came time for Israel to begin the march up to the Promised Land, Moses implored them to come across into the Promised Land with Joshua and live with the Israelites. And many of them did. Most of them did, apparently. Then we find them showing up in Judges chapter 5 in Deborah's song about the battle with the really bad king of the Canaanites in the north. Megiddo was where they were based in. And their leader, their commander, field commander, was Sisera. The field commander under Deborah, she was the judge, because there were no men in Israel who were worth being judges at the time. So she was the judge, God chose. And she had a guy named Barak, who was her general. He was sort of her assistant and the one that would go and do what she said to go and do. But he didn't like going and doing things on his own, so he insisted she go along to the battle. Anyway, the Israelites routed the Canaanite army, but the commander got away. And he was running for his life back to Megiddo, and he came into the settlement of the Kenites, and he thought, well, they're not Israelites, they'll save me. So he found there was one lady there, Jael. And he said, I'm so-and-so and so-and-so, you got to save me. And he said, oh, go into the tent, I'll hide you. I'll hide you in the tent. So she hid him in the tent, and she gave him gobs and gobs and gobs of yogurt laced with calcium. You know how you lace yogurt with calcium? You make it out of milk. It's got a lot of calcium in it. And what does calcium do? Makes you sleepy. Which doesn't look like most of you had your calcium today. You're still awake. I'm glad to see that. While he was therefore sleeping, she made sure he stayed put until the authorities arrived. She staked him down with a tent peg through the temples. in other words, she killed the commander of the Canaanite army. She got the glory for the battle, not Barak. And Deborah had told him that. She prophesied that that would happen. She was a Kenite. Now, further down the line in the clan, Jonadab came up. And Jonadab was a great leader among the Kenites. My guess is that they had a problem with alcoholism. And so he said, don't drink alcohol. Which makes me wonder, where did they go after that? You see, American Indian tribes, many of them, genetically addict easily to alcohol. That's been a great plague for them ever since the early 1800s, early 1700s. And by the same token, you have the counterpart in Southeast Asia. You find tribes there that almost never addict. Oh, they can get drunk if they try hard enough. They don't addict, though. They don't get addicted to the drug because of genetic reasons. They just have a high resilience to the addiction element of it, which is interesting. I kind of wonder, though, because the Kenites, under the Rechabites, under Jonadab, he recognized this was a problem, and he wanted his people to be sober and savvy and wise. You wonder, well, maybe sometime they were still around in the time of Jeremiah when the Jews were being scattered about through the world to a certain degree, mostly in Babylon and then back into the Promised Land. But maybe they migrated, and maybe they're the ancestors of one or more of American Indian tribes. It's just a wonder. I can't speculate with detail or anything beyond that particular aspect of it. But whatever the case, they looked up to Jonadab because he told them how they should live and how they should remain pure. And God was very pleased with Jonadab and with the Rechabites generally. So through Jeremiah, he made the statement that Jonadab would always have a man to serve God. It would always, throughout the generations, and undoubtedly that is even happening today, we just don't know who it is. That's when we get the history, and we find out lineages, then we'll say, there it is. There's the fulfillment. But this was the Jonadab that Jehu ran into. So we'll go back from Genesis 30, or from Jeremiah 35. I'll let you read the rest of that later. It gives you the details of how they were dedicated to the values that Jonadab handed down to them. 250 years later, they hadn't dropped anything. And they continue to exist. The Jewish scholars think that they were either a clan of skilled scribes, or they were metal workers, skilled metal workers, or maybe a combination thereof, which means they were cerebral. To do metal work, you have to have brains as well as good hands. And likewise with being a scribe, meaning one who writes. So we're back in chapter 10 of 2 Kings. And so Jonadab says that my heart is right with your heart. And so he gave him his hand, and Jehu pulled him up into the chariot. Come with me and see my zeal for the eternal, he said in verse 16. And they went to Samaria, where he killed all who remained in Ahab in Samaria and destroyed them. So he wiped out all of Ahab's descendants, just as God had said to do. And then he gathered the people together in verse 18. Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. Won't serve him in quite the same way as you're accustomed, but he will serve him much. And so then he called for a great gathering of all the Baal worshipers, all the priests of Baal who were diffused throughout all the land of the house of Israel. Proclaim a sacred assembly there in verse 20. So they proclaimed it. And he sent throughout all Israel, and all the worshipers of Baal came. There wasn't a man who didn't come. And then with Jonadab with him, he addressed the crowd. In verse 23, Jehu and Jonadab, the son of Rechab, went into the temple of Baal and said to the worshipers of Baal, search and see that no servants of the eternal are here. We only want the Baal worshipers. They didn't have a clue, I think. And so they searched, and then Jehu appointed 80 men on the outside and said, if you let anybody get away out of this building, then you'll die. they didn't let anybody get away. They annihilated the entire priesthood of Baal in one fell swoop. It was a bloodbath, but it had to be eradicated. And this is the way God said for it to be done. So it's remarkable. Look at what Jehu has done. He has taken the country out of the clutches of Jezebel, the high priestess of Baal, out of any of the influence of those who were her minions, these priests of Baal. He had eradicated that religion from the nation. They were moving forward, doing what the Lord God said, except now we come into the unfortunate, almost there, kind of situation. However, Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, this is verse 29, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin, that is from the golden calves that were at Bethel and Dan. That was the national religion. When Israel became a nation, we have our national customs now. We're not 250 years old yet, but we're closing in on it. We're in the 240s. And it was about almost just within a handful of years difference that Israel had existed then to what America has existed in modern times. And we have things that are, sort of become a part of our culture, intrinsic to it. Well, Jehu broke the Baal part out because that was relatively recent addition, but he went back to what in essence was their national religion. America has a national religion now, has several of them actually, but the one main one is traditional Christianity, still. It's waning, but it's still that. And yet we know that traditional Christianity is laced with Baal worship and golden calf worship in essence, because its doctrines are drawn from paganism, which is why it doesn't teach the truth of the Bible. And their eyes are closed to that. They don't know that yet. It isn't clear to those who do that. And in verse 30, God said to Jehu, "But because you have done well in doing what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your son shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation." I'm going to give you that. You'll have a dynasty, 4 generations of it. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart, for he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, who had made Israel sin. And you think, oh, wow, we were almost there. It's just like that. You remember the original Star Wars movie, and they're getting ready to fire the torpedoes that are going to destroy the Death Star. And the one officer is saying, almost there, except that they weren't. You had to have Luke Skywalker come in and save the day. They were almost there. And then they snatched defeat from the jaws of victory instead of the other way around. They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. But Jonadab had served well, and Jeremiah, 250 years later, Jeremiah attests to the great lineage and the great influence of Jonadab. Jezebel was done. What can we learn when we stop to think about all of this? What can we learn from reading this biblical account and reflecting upon it? I think there are 4 things to consider. And this is how you study an event in the Bible, and whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, because there are great lessons, vital lessons we need to draw from this. We do that from history generally. But when we look at the biblical history, this is the divine history. This is God's Word. There's so much more import and impact to it in our lives. But we have to extract the lessons. So number 1, we learn human nature. Again, we need to memorize the human nature scriptures. Maybe you already do. Have them memorized. Jeremiah 17:9. The heart, meaning the human or the unconverted heart. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Memorize that. And then Romans 8:7 is the other definition of human nature. The carnal mind, meaning the physically oriented and focused mind, the unconverted mind. The carnal mind is enmity, which means hatred or angry or set against. is enmity against God. It is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. That's why we repent of the human nature that we have, so that we can take on the divine nature. So we learn the stories of human nature here, don't we? Jezebel's, even Jonadab's, even Jehu's, less so Jonadab's. He was a man of character. There's another lesson too, and we turn to Daniel chapter 2 for this one. Daniel chapter 2, second lesson. In fact, Daniel has a lot to say. You could find several other statements of this in the book of Daniel. But chapter 2 will suffice it. Chapter 2, of course, is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had when Daniel was just sort of inducted into the Magi, the wise men crowd of the nation. He and his three friends, Azariah, Ananiah, and Mishael. Or Ananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. I think that's the way it is. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Babylonian names. The other names were they're Hebrew names. Just like Daniel was his Hebrew name, and Belshazzar was his Babylonian name. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar had the dream. Remember this story? Come back and read it later. It's really good. And he wakes up in the morning, and he has to know the meaning of the dream. So he calls his wise guys in, and he said, I had this dream last night, and I got to know the interpretation of it. It was just incredible. And he said, tell me the meaning of the dream. And he said, well, tell us the dream. We'll tell you the meaning of the dream. He said, I can't do that. I forgot the dream. It's out of my head, but I got to know the meaning of it. And they said, well, if you tell us the dream, then he says, don't you hear anything? I don't know what the dream was. You mean you're supposed to be my wise men, and you can't tell me what the dream was that I had and what it means? And then, of course, the jig was up, because that's exactly right. He had just cut through all the flack, and their lives were on the line, literally, because he got mad. And he said, I'm going to start killing you off until you can tell me what the dream was and what the meaning was. So the executioner liked Daniel, and he got to Daniel in his three friends' house, and he said, this is what the king says. And Daniel says, really? He just needs to know about the dream and what it means? He says, give me a minute. And so he went and prayed about it, and God revealed it to him. And he went and told it. He saved the lives of a lot of wise men because Daniel intervened and brought the dream, which was the great image of the golden head and the silver arms, which golden head was Babylon. The silver arms were the Persian Empire that was going to come and take over. And then the belly and thighs of brass was the Greek Empire under Alexander. And then the legs of iron and feet of clay and iron, that was the Roman Empire that would all follow. Of course, we know that dream. That's a fundamental outline of human history from that point forward. So Daniel explained it. And in verse 20, though, he is showing the lesson that we need to learn. God rules all. Nothing happens that God doesn't allow to happen. Now, he allows us to sin, but even in doing that, he's ruling. Nothing is done out of God's awareness or outside of his realm of power. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, in verse 20. For wisdom and might are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. Studying what we just studied back in the Old Testament makes this point. God rules all, including us. You can make a comparison. Here's another lesson. We have number 3. A comparison to today's politics, because we're always looking for models to try to analyze things. You could compare Jehu to the conservative movement in America, looking at it in American national politics, or generally in the world, really. The conservative movement in the world, and whether it's in this nation or another one, is better than the alternative, the liberal movement? as far as God's law goes, but it is still the wrong form of religion. Whatever it is that they worship is still the wrong form. And that's what Jehu turned out to be. He did what was right up to a point, and then he snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. What about Jezebel? Well, you could easily compare Jezebel to the liberal movement, and I'm not saying the political parties, because you have people in political parties that are in wrong parties. They need to be with the other ones, and vice versa. Liberal movement is throwing off the shackles of codes and conduct and behavior established by mankind in its more conservative thinking. This really began with a vengeance in the 1960s with the sex and drug revolution. With a vengeance. And it has continued right on. That's the liberal movement that we see around us. Grossly false values akin to the pagan values of old. And you'll find that if you want to see where modern rank paganism is, not the sort of subdued Christianity adopted paganism, but the rank paganism, you would look in the liberal movement, and you'll find it there. The Iron Man burning out in the Arizona desert every year. That's a pagan celebration. We don't get it so much out here, at least openly in the Midwest or the East. It's too cold in the wintertime. The hippies were sissies, and they all wanted to live where it was warm. And so that's why it happens back there in the West and the Southwest and places like that. That would be Jezebel. You could compare that to there, and we've got another reason why to compare to that as well. And then Jonadab. Well, what would Jonadab be similar to? Well, maybe he's similar to God's people who could see through things and knew that there needed to be the standards based on God's way. And he had an understanding. Whether he had a full understanding, that's another question. But he had an understanding. He had a great deal of true wisdom, much more than Jehu had, even though Jehu for a time had some good wisdom. And then number 4, and we turn to Revelation 22 and verse 20 for this one. Revelation 2 and verse 20. Revelation 2 and 3, as you know, are the prophecies to the 7 churches. These were 7 congregations the Apostle John pastored in his later ministry. They are named after the towns that they were from. Thyatira, for example, in verse 18, is the congregation in Thyatira. Now, we also know that it wasn't simply a reference or a summary of these 7 congregations, because there are historical markers in various of the prophetic elements of these messages that tell us these are historical eras of the Church of God. And we're down in the territory where Philadelphia is dissolving into Laodicea. Not that everybody's going to be Laodiceans, but we're in the era of Laodicea. And the Philadelphian era is running a losing battle within society. We want to not let it lose its battle in our own lives. Be faithful and true. So the Thyatira came earlier, and there were always troubles. There were always difficulties that each of the congregations faced, and each of the eras would face. These, to the angel of the church in Thyatira, verse 18, these things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet fine brass. I know your works, I know your love, your service, your faith, and your patience. And as for your works, the last are greater than the first. Nevertheless, in other words, they got more dynamic and powerful as they went forward. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel. Now, it probably wasn't her name, but she was a Jezebel. Jezebel became the classic example of an evil pagan, worshiping, bloodthirsty woman. Very evil. The epitome of it. That you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants, meaning the brethren, to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. And I gave her a time to repent of her sexual immorality, but she did not repent. So you see, we can look back and you can see how Jezebel comes back to life in the New Testament, even into the history of God's church. Now, looking back at what we've read about Jezebel and other reading you can do, you can see the kind of things she led the people into in the northern kingdom of Israel. And this Jezebel was encouraging sexual immorality and pagan conduct within the church. That's why we don't want to have pagan conduct within the church at all, or sexual immorality. So we're warned. So we go back and read the story. It is a sobering warning, the history of Israel at that time. And then we come forward and read the prophecy that applies into the church down through the ages and certainly in principle to us today. And we can then appreciate the value of that lesson that we read in the Old Testament. The biblical stories are vital. It's very, very important that we are reading some of these regularly in our Bible study, brethren, and drawing the lessons from them. Using the example of Jehu, Jezebel, and Jonadab helps us to be able to apply those principles.